Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
Indie Alaska is an innovative weekly web series capturing the diverse and colorful lifestyle of Alaskans. Real stories of everyday Alaskans at work and play. Supported in part by Alyeska Pipeline Service Company.
Cook Inlet Tug and Barge is a marine transportation company specializing in harbor services with a primary marketing focus on the Port of Anchorage, providing their customers with quality-based service specifically tailored to their needs.
The National Weather Service.
And good Saturday to you and yours. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider from the National Weather Service. It's the 13th of September now. As always, we encourage you to stay up to date with your latest weather information by heading to our website at weather.gov/Alaska or arh.noaa.gov. Your local weather service office sites that you use will work just as well. The weather info line is open at 800-472-0391. You can find each weather service office on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. And during the day, look for more information there between the shows here on Alaska Weather. The hazardous weather outlook for tonight includes nothing, no watches, warnings, or advisories at this point for southeastern Alaska. A small stream flood advisory continues for the eastern Kenai Peninsula and into the western sections of Prince William Sound, thanks to some pretty heavy rainfall over the last 24 hours. In some cases, like Seward, you've seen more than 2.5 inches of rain. Of course, that has put some stress on the Lowell Creek as well as Resurrection River there, and again, levels seem to be coming down now as the heaviest rain has subsided in that area, but you still need to be advised and aware that those river and stream levels may be unusually high as we go through the rest of the weekend in many areas on the Kenai Peninsula. A high wind warning is in effect for the eastern Alaska range as well. Looking farther northward, some of the stronger winds now will focus across the eastern sections of some of Alaska's higher peaks. Those winds could gust out of the south around 70 miles per hour or so. Sustained winds still around 30 to 40 miles per hour, so watch for some stronger gusts through the evening and overnight hours. That'll go until about midnight tonight for the strongest winds in the Deltana and Tanana Flats region. Still looking at some stronger winds, gusts upwards of 55 miles per hour. That will continue at least until 4 o'clock Sunday afternoon. So we're still looking for some hefty winds moving across some of the higher terrain there out of the Copper River Basin and northward into the Alaska Range. Now on the other side of the system, a much stronger area of low pressure has been focusing some upward moving air, and we have seen showers and thunderstorms developing. This is from about an hour or so ago, so about let's say 4 o'clock south and east of Galena to just north of McGrath, which is just south of what you're looking at. Every one of these red pluses and minus signs is an indication of a lightning strike. This is from the Alaska Interagency mapping service here, and you can find this information online anytime. We like to use it to track lightning, and out ahead of the upper level low, which is still out over the Bering, we've had some thunderstorm development here. So just a small patch of land in Alaska that was experiencing a little bit different weather that you might associate a little bit less with a fall storm and more of summer activity. This is just due to the storm alone. You can see that storm spiraling itself in on itself across the southern Bering Sea. It's a really pretty picture when you look at it from outer space. Underneath, though, quite a different story. A lot of rain and wind across southwestern Alaska and across south central Alaska. Out across the North Pacific, several waves of moisture working into the region. This is all being brought into that low slowly and surely, and several other impulses that will probably be a little re-energized as they get closer to the Gulf of Alaska and the northern Pacific, thanks to this persistent upper level storm that continues to move its way eastward very slowly toward Bristol Bay as we go through the remainder of the weekend. Here's a storm over Alaska, and you can see same system, but it's a little bit closer in now. Southeastern Alaska enjoying fine weather because of this. As a result, Annette actually tied the record high today of 72 degrees. The last time they did that was this date in 1974, so a pretty warm day down in Annette. Of course, that heat and the ridge of high pressure that you can see holding back that moisture across the Gulf of Alaska is actually tied into a much stronger ridge across all of the western contiguous 48 states, down through British Columbia, all the way down to Baja California. It is hot there. And in some cases, temperatures were well over 100 degrees in Southern California and places like, I believe, Long Beach and areas surrounding greater Los Angeles. So just unusual heat for this time of the year, and that heat actually worked its nose into southeastern sections of Alaska today with record-setting heat there. Now, as that's holding back that moisture plume, it's going to focus that fire hose effort right there around Prince William Sound. Some of that will gradually diminish over the next 24 hours, but there's still quite a bit of moisture working its way northward, and you can see the clouds working all the way around the Arctic coast and then wrapping back into the vacuum that is low pressure across the southern Bering. Well, there's only a number of times that this storm can actually wrap in on itself, and it is probably about done doing this. Any frontal boundary characteristics that were out across the western Bering or the North Pacific are pretty much fizzling out, and instead of being a very different air mass working north and east, it's now mixing into something a little bit more of the same. So this low will continue to be on the map, but it's weakening. It's filling in with all the air surrounding it, as it is nothing more than a vacuum. But it is something pretty to behold, and out across the southwestern coastline, periods of wind and rain will continue. The Alaska Peninsula will still be fairly gusty. The eastern Aleutians will still be fairly breezy, and the high wind warning for the central and eastern chain at this point has been dropped, as has the one over the Anchorage, Turnagain Arm region and the hillside, as we looked at last night. The weather map shows the occlusion across the Gulf of Alaska. This will fall apart very quickly in the next 12 hours or so. High pressure also seen just south and west of Haida Gwaii. Periods of heavy rain will continue around Prince William Sound. That should wind down slowly through the evening and overnight hours and into tomorrow. Still looking for rain across a large part of the region. Showers from time to time throughout tonight and tomorrow, but don't expect the great onslaught of heavier rainfall after tomorrow afternoon around Prince William Sound. Watch for periods of rain around Kotzebue Sound and through the Kobuk and Noatak valleys. There's our low pressure system there, currently at 966 millibars. As we go in through tomorrow, it will fill into 978. There's still going to be some waves of rain working through tonight and into tomorrow, but the trough of low pressure should preclude heavier rainfall, or really a whole lot of rain, or any rain for that matter, around the middle Tanana Valley and the upper Yukon Valley. So if you're in Fairbanks and eastward, still looks like a fairly mild night for you. Showers will be located a little bit further northward towards the Brooks Range. Frontal boundary dropping southward out of the coastal plain will hover pretty close to the higher terrain there. Low pressure just west of Bristol Bay at 985 millibars will keep its wind efforts around Kodiak Island, Bristol Bay, and the southwestern Capes and coastline, eastern chain, and the Alaska Peninsula. Rain will be limited to areas generally west of Juneau, Gustavus to Yakutat, and that's really where the primary focus will be. Anything south of that, as you see, might be a sunny day, and it should certainly be a dry day for you on Sunday in southeast. So enjoy that while you have it. And across the west, a very weak ridge of high pressure trying to hold back the next little impulse of a low at 1006 millibars. Some showers out across the western Bering, the Seward Peninsula and Norton Sound, and some areas around Galena and just east there. A chance for some showers to develop. By Monday, that drops southward again as the low pressure continues to wobble around the Yukon-Kuskokwim coastline at 994 millibars. Now that little impulse out across the Aleutians has grabbed onto some cooler air. The frontal boundary should drop southward. It's not terribly strong, but it might bring up the waves a little bit more. A few areas of rain across the eastern chain. High pressure starting to lose ground across southeast, and what happens? Well, the clouds and the rain start to sneak back in from the north and west side. So from Yakutat to Gustavus and Juneau, once again, a better chance for rainfall. Some of that could creep down towards Sitka by late Monday. And Annette, Ketchikan, Craig, Klawock, Hyder, Petersburg even. You're still looking at fairly dry weather as we go into Monday, with showers around the south-facing slopes of the Brooks Range and some low clouds and light rain, maybe drizzle across the Arctic coast from Wainwright all the way to Kaktovik, maybe as far south as Point Hope and Point Lay. Temps today were pretty mild, as you would guess, across southern southeast. We saw readings as high as 72 there around Annette. Ketchikan a little bit cooler. Mid-50s around Petersburg. Hyder at 64. Juneau also in the mid-50s to lower 60s in the region. 60 in Sitka, 58 around Yakutat. Mid-50s around Prince William Sound. Anchorage was 58, 62 in Homer, and 59 in Kodiak. Looking northward, Fairbanks was 73, 63 in Eagle, about the same there as Fort Yukon, and mid to upper 30s for the Arctic coast. Barrow was only 38 today. Kotzebue Sound temperatures were in the mid-50s, 55 around Nome. The YK Delta held in the upper 50s and lower 60s today, thanks to that warm and wet air pouring over. The Alaska Peninsula was in the mid-50s. The Pribilofs held temperatures in the lower to mid-50s today. St. Paul was 56, low 50s for Adak and Atka, and 53 in Shemya. Overnight lows won't change a whole lot out across the chain or the Alaska Peninsula, as they usually don't this time of the year. 49 around St. George and St. Paul. Lower 50s around Dillingham and King Salmon. The middle Yukon Valley and Tanana Valley should be looking at temperatures into the mid-40s overnight, with Nome holding at 47. The Arctic coast in the lower 30s, just a hair above freezing for many, and mid-40s to low 50s for southeast, with south central closer to 50 degrees. Warming to about 60 tomorrow. Mid to upper 50s for the chain, and the Alaska Peninsula will close in on 60 degrees like Sand Point. 55 degrees around St. Paul. Bethel looking at 57 degrees, with Norton Sound and Unalaska a little bit closer to 60 tomorrow. You'll see temperatures just shy of 60 in Nome, and low 70s possible again for Fairbanks. The surrounding countryside probably in the upper 60s. The Arctic coast, upper 30s to about 42. A little bit warmer down toward Wainwright. Again, remember, a lot of warm and wet air and southerly winds will be working toward your area. And southeast should expect temperatures in the lower 60s, with some areas around Annette and Ketchikan perhaps pushing that 70-degree mark once again. We'll see if you can get another day of record-setting heat. Flying weather includes IFR across the northern Gulf Coast from Yakutat westward toward Cordova and through the Barren Islands and the southern tip of the Kenai Peninsula, which likely includes Homer and parts of Kamishak Bay from time to time. IFR around Nunivak Island, the north coastline for the Alaska Peninsula, in areas just south of Bethel and the YK Delta. The Arctic coast looking at IFR, especially right and north of the coastline, and also to the south and west of the west central Aleutian chain. Here's your pass conditions then. Anaktuvik Pass expected to be VFR. Same goes for Adigan Pass tomorrow. Things will worsen once again during the day for Lake Clark and Merrill Pass, going from MVFR toward IFR conditions in both passes. Rainy Pass should go over to MVFR conditions throughout the day, and visibility will probably improve around Windy Pass heading toward VFR. Isabel Pass should also see similar improvements, with Mantasta Pass seeing ceilings lift gradually to VFR. And expect Tanita Pass to see some improvements during your Sunday. Portage Pass will likely hold at MVFR, especially for the eastern half, and Chilkoot and White Pass will hover around MVFR through a good chunk of the day. Freezing levels show that warm air punching all the way into the Yukon, anywhere from 10 to 12,000 foot freezing levels there. 6 to 8,000 foot freezing levels generally from Prince William Sound and westward. You can see those numbers diving off as you head into the west coast and out toward the St. Matthew Island waters. And then a little bit of that weak ridge showing itself there with the higher freezing levels between 8 and 10,000 feet. So we've got a lot of warm and wet air, especially now over the eastern half of Alaska. And no wonder it's raining so hard. There's a ton of moisture to wring out. Icing potential generally above 6,000 feet there across the YK coastline around Bristol Bay. Some of that could reach occasional moderate again. We've continued to see a lot of lift and a lot of moisture associated with this cold core low. Above 10,000 feet for the northern Gulf Coast, and way up there also for areas east of Kaktovik, a slightly elevated freezing threat for tomorrow. Again, that could be light to isolated moderate and generally rime conditions for most areas. The jet stream shows low pressure now across the south and western coastline. This impulse right here is what's driving our current storm. We've got another low that's dropping eastward out of the Kamchatka Peninsula, and that will likely stir things up once again. The main core of the jet stream, though, with all the cold air, is right across the North Pacific, stretching out of eastern Asia and then dropping southward. That's between 90 and about 150 knots. You can see that northwesterly flow also across northwestern Canada. Now underneath that at 9,000 feet, you've got a broad southerly flow coming across the Gulf of Alaska. And that is starting to push winds in from 35 to about 45 knots. Some of the stronger winds coming across some of our more interesting volcanoes and Nova Rupta group. 45 knots there, 30 knots north of Nunivak Island, more of a west and northwesterly flow across the chain between 30 and 50 knots. At 3,000 feet, a low pressure system also stacked right over Bristol Bay. You'll notice the winds coming right over Bethel from the east, about 25 knots, more of a west and northwesterly flow across the eastern chain between 20 and 40 knots. Winds are generally light across the Gulf of Alaska between 15 and 20 knots, and an east-southeasterly flow over Kaktovik and the Beaufort Seacoast from about 15 to 25 knots. Turbulence potential continues to be elevated across the southwestern coastline, occasional to widespread moderate possible all the way from Bethel to Bristol Bay and perhaps as far west as Atka. Generally below 4,000 to 6,000 feet is where you'll find the worst chop there. You might still see some isolated severe tomorrow, though that threat should gradually diminish. Below 8,000 feet across the Gulf of Alaska, reaching into Cordova and Middleton Island, and probably looking at some light chop generally north of the Arctic coastline below 2,000 feet. That's a look at your aviation forecast. We'll be back in just a few minutes with your marine weather. Stay tuned.
The flood that buried Fairbanks in water that was 4 to 5 feet deep started on August 8th, 1967.
We had strong southwest flow in August 1967. And this provided a very large area of moisture from the North Pacific and the southern Bering Sea to be lifted up and into interior Alaska. We had a stationary frontal boundary persist across interior Alaska for over a week. So as weather systems moved in off the North Pacific and into the Bering Sea, they moved across this frontal boundary. So we had continuous weather systems moving right across the interior, which kept bringing more and more rainfall to the Fairbanks area.
Now, there are a lot of conditions to help create this extensive, this persistent rainfall. And of course, moisture is one of them. But moisture from a typhoon?
It was Typhoon Hope, which had been spinning around in the Western Pacific, got pulled up into this flow, and that warm, moist air from the typhoon got pushed into the interior.
Normally, the Alaska rain prevents a lot of moisture from making its way into the Fairbanks area or into the interior. In August of 1967, that heavy influx of moisture from Typhoon Hope took a different path.
You've got the Alaska Range here, the Brooks Range here. There's really no high terrain here, and that moisture just can slide right in and right into Fairbanks. And when it came along this stationary boundary, and then the hills to our north, you know, all that air had to be lifted up, and it cooled, and it caused it to, enhance the precipitation.
So what was learned as a result of the 1967 flood? Well, it cost $240 million to build, and so far there hasn't been a flood since 1967. The closest Fairbanks came to flooding again was on June 4th, 1992.
The Chena Flood Control Project is upstream of downtown Fairbanks. If the water is expected to reach a certain level in downtown Fairbanks, they'll lower the gates here and start shaving off some of that water. If this floodway fills up all the way, the water will eventually get overtop this sill and go into the Tanana River and be diverted totally around Fairbanks.
Over 12,000 people were evacuated.
It was so strange to see this current going down the street and the boats going by, and then we got to Barnett Street. It was a little different then, but I just remember the rough water.
He thought something was internally wrong. Something had happened inside the house, like a pipe had burst or the sewer had backed up. He had no idea, none of us had any idea that the whole city was flooded. I mean, that was the furthest thing from our mind, thinking about the city flooding. There was no panic. There was just, we got a big problem.
Well, I was almost 5, and I just remember bits and pieces. I remember never being scared and thinking how cool it was watching the water rushing in around the cracks of the front door of our friend's house where we were staying at the time.
Military came and picked us up from our house in a boat. So here's a 4-year-old me sitting on the front of the boat thinking I'm just captain of the world.
There were a lot of very worried people, but everybody was pitching in and helping everybody else.
And then I found out we were actually going to be staying inside a high school on the 2nd floor. It was at Lathrop High School on the 2nd floor, which was a cool thing to me too, because I lived in a 1-story home.
The Lathrop Hilton was very busy, of course, with boats arriving and people coming. They wanted the names of everybody there, and then we were in touch with who was staying out at the universities. Always great confusion.
I remember being lifted out the next day by helicopter to the university from the rooftop. I remember that part, and I remember sleeping on tables up at the, I believe it was the Gruning buildings. The most frightened part, the river had washed the bridge away, and there was a beam that we had to walk across, this raging torrent, and I can remember having to walk across that with my mother and being very frightened. And I remember that being the only real scary part. The rest of it, from a 5-year-old's perspective, was pretty cool.
If I learned anything, it was that there's no need to panic. As long as safety's first, and as long as everyone's safe, the rest is just property.
What makes you stay?
Well, I guess the people. I've always had such a good time here. I enjoyed teaching. I liked it when I worked at the News Miner. I'm involved in lots of things here. I just like the people.
Well, first of all, I talked to some of the old timers, and they said, oh, we'll get maybe a little bit of water in the basement. So I listened to the old timers, but I also, something in my gut told me that this could be a problem.
It was a continuous rain. I mean, there'd be very few breaks.
And this thing came in the night, you know. I got a hold of Bill Wally, and I said, "Hey, Bill, get on the radio and tell them that we may be having flooding here." And we woke up, and the next morning, and the city was underwater.
They handed me a sleeping bag and a radio. Safeway was across where the post office is now. They looked like they might have had a half-inch of water in there. They were pumping it out and trying to keep it out.
Was there concern about looting?
Well, there wasn't to start with. Here come two teenagers in a brand new canoe that was loaded to the gun wall. I just picked up the radio and said, what's the procedure on looting? And immediately Red Boucher's voice, the mayor of Fairbanks, came back and said, unhesitatingly said, shoot on sight. And there was no more looting in Fairbanks.
What has stayed with you till now that you can remember about the flood?
20 years of military and especially combat training. If you take action, and if you end up with egg all over your face, so you made a mistake. If you don't take action and people lose their lives, you will regret it forever.
The mood of the community when the flood hit.
Fantastic. Probably if you look through the archives, I called it the can-do city. At that particular time of year, we were not that far from freeze-up, and the whole community, from the university, Dr. Wood, everybody just pitched in, and I was very proud of them.
Would you change anything if you went through it today?
Not a bit. No, And I'm just thankful I had that gut instinct to go ahead and do what we did. I live in Anchorage now, but Fairbanks will always be my home of heart. They're just a different bunch of people. True pioneer spirit. So, hey, anything we want, anything we set our mind to do in Fairbanks, we get done.
All right, it's a look at the 1967 flood there. Sunday's marine forecast shows a broad southerly flow with a few minor interruptions. You can see that onshore wind coming into the Dixon entrance becoming a little more northwesterly with times to head southward. But you can see most of the inner waterways looking at southerly wind anywhere from 10 to about 20 knots and 2 to as high as 4-foot seas in the Northern Canal. Now Monday, a little bit of a change. The coastal area is starting to pick up a little bit more of that southern influence, so the winds turn a little bit, but the wind speeds are about the same, 10 to 20 knots there across the coast, 9 to 10-foot seas, and across the inner waterways, 10 to 20 knot winds, generally from the south with the exception being the Clarence Strait, 10 knots there with a 2-foot sea. Across south central Alaska, that broad southeasterly flow still affecting Prince William Sound all the way down the western coastline through the Barrens and across Kodiak Island, looking at 30 knots there, 15 knots on the western side of the Gulf of Alaska. 8 to 12-foot seas are expected for most areas. Across the Cook Inlet, 10-knot winds in the northern half. Now once you get south of Kenai, you're looking at winds as high as 30 to 35 knots, some of those really being influenced by the wind coming over the higher terrain and off the Harding ice field, and then dropping down quickly across the coastal plain and over the Barren Islands. Again, 35 knots or so with 10 to 12-foot seas. For Monday, that broad southeasterly flow starts to see some interruptions from the next weather system moving in with the southwesterly flow on either side of Kodiak Island, 20 to 25 knots with 9 to 11-foot seas. Across Prince William Sound, winds are dropping down to about 20 knots with an easterly flow, 4-foot seas, and still watch for some higher gusts there outside of the Hitchinbrook entrance and then south of Cordova into the northern Gulf coastal areas. For the Alaskan Peninsula, watch for some stronger winds, mainly on the Pacific side on Sunday. Looking at some higher gusts west and south of Kodiak Island to Sand Point, 35 to 40 knots sustained, but there will be higher gusts in there with seas as high as 18 to 21 feet. A northwesterly flow north of Cold Bay, southeasterlies inside of Bristol Bay with an 8-foot sea. By Monday, a broad westerly flow sweeping through, 25 knots in all areas, 8 to 10-foot seas on the north side and 10 to 12-foot seas across the Pacific side for Monday. Across the Aleutians, westerlies are in command on Sunday with 15 knots in the west, 35 to 40 knots in the east, 16-foot seas there south of Nikolsky and Unalaska, and 11 to 12-foot seas on the Bering side. By Monday, look for a little bit more of a southwesterly shift. Winds are diminishing still across the Bering, down to 20 knots in the Pacific and 15 knots from the west and northwest across Kiska and Attu. About 6-foot seas there expected for Monday. For the west coast, northeasterlies bending into low pressure heading for the Bristol Bay region. Northeasterlies will come off the Yukon-Kuskokwim coastline, so you're looking at about 20 to 30 knots or so with 6 to 9-foot seas. Northwesterlies inside the Pribilofs, and with a 10-foot sea expected for Sunday, becoming westerly at 15 with 6-foot seas on Monday. Northerlies now coming out of the Bering Strait at 15 to 20 knots, and seas diminished to 4 and 5 feet. Easterlies are still coming out of the Beaufort seacoast at 30 to 35 knots with seas as high as 11 feet. Southeasterlies coming out of Kotzebue Sound and off of Point Hope at 15 knots for Sunday. Seas will continue to build as we get into Monday, coming up to 5 feet outside of Kotzebue Sound, 20 knots with a northerly flow, and east and northeasterly winds coming across the Beaufort and Chukchi seacoast between 20 to as high as 35 knots north of Kaktovik, 20 knots there north of Point Barrow. That's a look at your marine forecast. Let's recap what's going on around Alaska tonight with the surface weather. We've got a stalled boundary across the Gulf of Alaska. Some of the highest rainfall totals will likely be across the eastern half of Prince William Sound tonight, as this front pretty much parks and traps that fire hose of moisture right across the northern Gulf coastal areas. Now, high pressure still in command of southeastern Alaska, pretty much. There's going to be a few showers across the northern sections of southeast, but by and large, most of southeast should be dry the next couple days. As low pressure is held at bay out across Bristol Bay at 978 millibars, there will still be some gusty winds around the Alaska Peninsula and the eastern chain. Look for areas of moderate to occasionally heavy rainfall, especially on the south-facing coastlines and hills of the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island. Showers north of the Yukon Valley, maybe even a few thunderstorms tonight for areas generally around Galena and northward. As we look into Sunday, frontal boundary still dropped across the Brooks Range. We'll keep mainly dry weather there, but the trough of low pressure just along the Alaska Range and north should help to keep the middle Tanana and upper Yukon Valley fairly dry, but breezy. Wind advisories continue for the Deltana and Tanana Flats region, with high wind warnings continuing for the eastern Alaska Range. That's your Alaska weather. Thanks for watching.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.